Hey everyone, welcome to the Marriage Starts at Home podcast. This is a podcast produced by Shalom Task Force. I'm your host, Yeshaya Kraus. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm also the Community Engagement and Education Manager for Shalom Task Force. The point of this podcast is to speak about and to introduce people to different ideas and different techniques and skills that come up in marriage. We're going to talk about all sorts of different pieces of marriage. We'll hopefully be speaking with therapists, rabbanim, all sorts of people who are involved in marriage and helping and supporting couples in making their marriage into the best that they possibly can. So obviously right now in this time in the world, there's a lot of chaos going on. Many people are stuck at home and presumably stuck at home with their spouses. Now, one of the things that, one of the questions that's raised is, what's your marriage going to look like when all of this is over with? For some, the answer, and hopefully this is the answer for many of us, for some the answer is it's going to be great. We're spending quality time together, getting to know each other more, and all that nice stuff. And unfortunately, there are those who might give the answer of, my marriage is going to be terrible. How am I going to survive being in the same house with my spouse all day, every day? We might be here for months. Somebody help me. This is, and from what we're seeing in the information that's coming out of China right now, divorce courts, family courts, the numbers are rising as the isolation and imposed quarantine lifts in China. And we want to make sure that we're in much better shape than those folks over there. And just for ourselves, we want to know that our marriage is top priority and that we are working and doing what we can to make sure that we have the best possible outcomes. So those folks who are answering that their marriage is going to end up being terrible when they get out of this isolation, when this whole coronavirus situation lifts, what's really going on in their marriage? What would make them say that things are terrible and that they're anticipating being at each other's throats by, say, the end of the month? What does their marriage look like that would give them that idea? So obviously we don't know the specific situation. We don't know all the finer details about what's going on and what the interactions are like and their dynamics. But it's pretty safe to say that anyone who can give an answer like that has two things that are very prevalent in their marriage. Those things are conflict and tension. Now, conflict is a given. Conflict is there in any particular relationship. It doesn't matter what it is. There's always going to be conflict. And the closer the relationship is, the more likely it is that the differences in opinion, contrasting interests and needs will be much more emotionally charged. So you can have a very low-key, mundane relationship with, say, I don't know, the bus driver. You know, the guy who drives the city bus, the cashier in the local store, in which your whole relationship is you say good morning, you say thank you for the change, and then you leave. There's not really so much room for conflict there because there's not really much of a personal connection. Anytime that there's no real personal connection, your level of conflict is going to be much lower. As your relationship gets closer and you have more invested personally in a relationship, there's going to be a lot more that comes up in the context of your relationship that has the capability of conflicting with the other person. When you have a friend, you want to do one thing and the friend wants to do another thing, or you have your parents or siblings. It's a much closer relationship, and even more so when we're talking about a spouse. When a husband and a wife are married, they're pretty much sharing their entire lives together, or a good chunk of it, most of it for sure. And it's inevitable that things are going to come up that one person thinks one way and one person thinks the other way, whether it's a matter of opinion, whether it's a matter of politics, emotional needs, physical needs, whatever the issue is, there's going to end up being conflict there. And now, let's say you put a married couple in a situation where they have to spend an extended period of time in very close quarters. Obviously, conflict is going to come up. Obviously, there are going to be major differences that come up, and they're going to be pretty obvious the longer you end up spending time secluded together. And we're not even talking about relationships which are particularly unhealthy or even, God forbid, abusive. This is a completely normal thing to happen in any relationship. It can be the healthiest thing in the world. Conflict is a given. It's always there. There's going to be some kind of a disagreement there. The question is what you're going to do with that disagreement. So the other aspect of relationships that we mentioned is tension. Tension does not have to be so much of a given. The presence of tension really depends on what you do with the conflict that we've mentioned. It depends on how you address the conflict. If we work together on the conflict and we work to address each other's needs and to respect the other person's needs as being important to them and try to work together to find some kind of a compromise so that my needs don't contradict yours and your needs can be met and vice versa, tension can not only be either minimized or eliminated, but you can really use conflict as something which can help your relationship to grow by looking at the conflict, by appreciating it properly, by working through it together as a team. Then that shows each person, you're important to me and I want your needs to be met. That shows that you are someone important enough for me to work with and to make sure that your needs are met. And that really makes the relationship come closer together. It makes the two people really become much closer and makes the relationship a lot stronger. The question that presents itself at this point is, how do you make sure that the tension doesn't get out of control and help yourself to manage the conflict in a way which is not only doesn't hurt the marriage, doesn't hurt the relationship, but is also going to help the relationship to grow stronger, as we mentioned. And the answer is that there are definitely things that you can do, and it's not easy. Conflict resolution is a skill. You have to basically manage your own emotional responses. You have to be able to sublimate your own needs and your own wants and desires in order to really appreciate the needs and desires of the other person and to be able to come to some kind of a sensible compromise where your needs are being met and at the same time the other person's needs are met without feeling like they're really sacrificing anything. There are techniques you can learn. There are more structured conversations, but it's not just a matter of learning techniques. It's also a matter of practice. It's a matter of consistent practice. You have to be mindful of that. It has to be consistent. It has to be something that you really put time into. And this is something that, unless people are in a relationship crisis where they're acknowledging that things are really not going well, many people don't spend time working on it. Everyone knows that this is something which is very important. Everybody understands, yes, I need to learn how to resolve conflict. I need to know how to build my relationship. And everyone will tell you that's very important, but it doesn't really get that sense of urgency of this is something I have to do right now until it's a crisis. Until there are really bad fights or really bad arguments, and people just don't get that sense of urgency unless it's something you have to do right now. And people rationalize, they say, I don't have time for it, I need to take care of this, I need to take care of that, shopping, kids, job, I'll have time later. The answer, of course, the answer to that is that that later time is now. That later time is right now when we're all pretty much stuck in the house. And yeah, you're going to be in closer quarters for an extended period of time. You don't have to allow things to just go off the rails. You can take the opportunity to purposefully reconnect with the person who's supposed to be the most important person in your life. Before we actually work on conflict management and conflict solving techniques, it's important to understand what conflict is and why it really becomes so nasty. Conflict in itself, as we mentioned before, is a basic source of disagreement. It's I have one perspective, you have another perspective. Now, that doesn't have to lead to an emotional blowout. A lot of times, what happens is that there are a lot of other different things that are going on in your life that you're upset about, you're nervous about, scared about, angry about, whatever the actual feeling is, and for whatever reason, you don't allow those feelings to come out. You feel you have to be the cold, stoic one. You have to be strong. You have to. It's not appropriate for you to let out these feelings, but they stay there and they kind of bottle themselves up to the point where even if you're not really releasing the emotional energy that you have about item A, it's going to end up coming out when you eventually have to release that energy because of item E, F, or however much further down the line you want to go. So when people get into nasty conflicts, they're not really reacting to the thing that there's a disagreement about. They're reacting to item A and B and C and D and E, which is being given some form of expression by you allowing yourself to react to item F. And that's a very different story. The way that conflict is going to look is going to be very different than if you were just reacting to that one particular disagreement by itself. On a scale of 1 to 10, you may say that being upset about being late is maybe a 3 or a 4, but because you have all these other items that you're getting upset at, that are pushing you to get upset and that are boosting your reaction, the intensity of that reaction is going to get shot up all the way to 7 or 8. And it makes for a very different interaction, a very different dynamic in terms of trying to actually solve these issues. There's an analogy that I like to use, which is very useful in this kind of situation. It helps people to really understand how their emotional energy works and how different situations are going to impact the way they express themselves. I'm sure everybody's seen this before. You're sitting around and somebody tries opening up the nearest seltzer bottle and it explodes all over the place. Now, the reason for this is because every little jolt that you give to this seltzer bottle, every time you give it a little shake, the pressure at the top of the bottle builds up more and more. And eventually, when somebody opens that bottle, when somebody allows some of that gas to escape, all the pressure that's been building up behind the cap is going to blow out and the seltzer is going to fly all over the place. And it's a huge mess, obviously. You have to clean it up and everybody gets wet and nobody's happy about it. Well, the way you express yourself emotionally is very similar. As we said, every little thing that happens to you, whether it's negative or positive, builds up a certain emotional pressure. It builds up a certain emotional energy. And the more you keep it bottled up inside, the more it's going to leap at the chance to explode outwards. So the second that you have one thing which is causing you to express yourself, you're upset at your spouse about this one thing, about being late, as we said, not only are you going to allow that particular feeling to have voice, you're also going to give voice to something that may have happened at work that you were upset about, or or you're also going to be putting into that whole mix being upset at your kids, or whatever other situations you may have gone through. They're all going to be coming out when you open up that cap a little bit. Now, the best way to deal with this really is to be able to figure out how to vent slowly in a controlled way those feelings that have been building up inside of you. The same way as you would do if you actually had a shaken up seltzer bottle. You know that this is shaken up. You open it up slowly, you let off a little bit of gas at a time. So you're able to kind of level it down to the point where you can open it up safely without the whole thing exploding. And it's very similar when we deal with our own emotions. You have to be able to kind of let off steam and express these feelings and kind of decompress that emotional energy that's building up inside you in a controlled way. One of the tools that we have in our Shalom workshop, which is the marriage workshop run by Shalom Task Force, is actually geared specifically towards giving couples the opportunity to vent their emotional energy towards each other and to be supportive of each other as they do it. Here's how it goes. So research shows that even though we may feel many different kinds of emotions, varying in, say, intensity and duration, how intense these emotions are, how long they last, there are really only 4 basic categories. We can help each other to decompress and balance out by helping each other talk about our feelings. So the first thing that you need to do, this is the first thing that we tell people to do in the Shalom workshop when we're emptying the emotional jug, as we call it, is to make sure that you set aside time that you're not going to be interrupted. This is not something that just takes a couple of minutes. This is something where you're talking about your feelings, you're talking about your experiences, and you want to make sure that you have time to actually do it justice. You also want to make sure that this is a purposeful discussion. You don't want it to be caught up in emotional distractions. You want to have certain things you want to talk about, certain things you want to think about, certain things you want to discuss. And the point of this is to really enable each spouse to let out that emotional energy, as we said, in a way which safely vents the energy off without either one of them, without the possibility of it blowing up. So the 4 basic categories of emotion, according to research, are generally labeled as happiness, that's one, sadness is another, fear/disgust is a third, and surprise/anger is a fourth. Each of these different areas are going to build up their own level of emotional intensity. And that's going to make it a lot harder to regulate the other areas. If you're trying to regulate your anger, you're going to have a lot less success in regulating your sadness, and vice versa. Each one of these emotions is going to impact your ability to regulate the other ones. And obviously, if you think about all the different things that go on during your day, there are going to be many different triggers that are going to set off each particular piece of each emotion. You're going to have a bunch of things that hopefully are making you happy. You're going to have a bunch of things that are making you feel sad. And by sadness, we don't mean depression, but meaning they bring you down. They bring you down. It doesn't have to be an intense sadness. Same with fear slash disgust or surprise and anger. There are all sorts of different things that are going to impact each other. Now, each of these areas build up their own levels, and you have to be able to vent each one. So in this emotional jug exercise, each spouse takes turns asking about what's been making the other experience each emotion. So here's how a model discussion might go. One spouse asks the other, the husband asks the wife, what are you angry about right now? What are you angry about today? And the wife thinks about it and lays out a few things. Oh, I'm angry this didn't go as well as I planned. I'm angry that you did A, B, and C, and that made me feel angry, and so on and so forth. So let's say the wife gives a few examples and then stops. Okay. So then the next question that the husband asks is, if you were angry about something else, what would it be? So what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to have each spouse help the other one kind of scrape the bottom of the barrel and really empty out the entire emotional jug, really vent out all that emotional energy by expressing it and sharing it. And this cycle goes on until the answer to that second question is nothing. Well, there's really nothing else that I would be angry about if I were angry. And that's the end of that anger discussion for that spouse. And then it goes to the other one. Each spouse is going to take turns asking those questions and answering those questions. So, and you go through the anger, you go through the happiness, you go through the sadness, you go through the fear slash disgust. Now, it's interesting because, first of all, this is not a problem-solving session. This is specifically and purely to help each spouse to express their emotions. Aside from being able to express your emotions and being able to kind of vent off that extra energy and prevent blowouts that way, it's also nice because by sharing your experiences with each other, by sharing what prompts certain emotions in you, you're also building your relationship. You're allowing yourself to be vulnerable by showing this is something that made me sad, this is something that made me happy. You're letting the other person see into your emotional world and how you work emotionally. Can feel also more secure knowing that when conflict and disagreement do come up, it's going to be much more focused on the issue at hand. You're much more likely to have that kind of an emotional blowout because you already vented that energy. So let's say there is a disagreement. You'll be able to stay more focused on the actual subject of the disagreement, and you won't feel the need as much to bring in all these other issues because you already vented them. You may not have problem solved them, but they're not just sitting there under pressure, bottled up, waiting to explode outwards. Even after being sure to clean out your emotional system regularly, let's say both you and your spouse have been very conscientious about doing this on a regular basis, whether it's daily or a couple times a week or even once a week, you're still going to have differences. You're still going to have different perspectives and contrasting opinions, and you're going to have different needs, and you're going to have different times that you don't see eye to eye. These conflicts may be contentious. Going through this emptying of the emotional jug on a regular basis is not necessarily going to stop conflict from being contentious. It may stop it, though, from involving, as we said, all these other pieces of it. But there may be different parts of your life which are very emotionally charged, and because they are emotionally charged, you're gonna want to fight to defend that. You're gonna want to fight to defend either whether it's an opinion or whether it's a need or whether it's something that's really important to you. That could theoretically turn into a real conflict. It could turn into something big. Now, as we said before, conflict is a normal part of a relationship. The question really is what you do with it. Hopefully, you'll be going into this difference without other aspects of your relationship, as we said, which make the conflict worse, which is in itself a huge step. It can still be very easy to bring other things in, though, especially if there are lasting relationship injuries or negative patterns. So this is something which is beyond just, oh, I feel that this is important, or I feel that you're not paying attention to this particular thing. Let's say a person's relationship is one in which communication is not all that great. Then aside from having this particular issue matter a lot to you personally and emotionally, the bigger issue that this represents is that maybe you feel like your spouse doesn't listen to you properly when you tend to bring up other things. So really right now when you're going into this conflict situation, you have two things that are going on. One is the actual event on the ground, and the second thing is the bigger umbrella issue that you feel like you're never listened to. And if your spouse runs the risk of kind of making the fire under that particular issue a lot hotter, by not responding in the same way. And this is not necessarily anybody's fault. This is just the way the system of your marriage runs at this point. Relationships have cycles that they tend to follow. And unless a person is really mindful about how the cycle of their relationship runs, it can be very difficult to change the way that runs and to improve it for yourself. The best way to really be mindful about anything in particular is to give it some sort of a structure, to have a certain program that you follow, which will allow you to hit certain points that you really want to think about. And changing the patterns of your relationship or working within the patterns of your relationship is really no different. Now, before we get into exactly what that structure might be, and we have a particular structure that we present in the Shalom workshop, before we get into that, just to come back to what we mentioned before, the idea that conflict is a natural part of a relationship, and it can have one of two functions. It can either drive a wedge between the two of you because neither of you feel your viewpoint is being respected and validated by the other. Your needs aren't being met, and you feel there's no attempt from the other side to bridge the gap. So if I have a need and my spouse is not meeting that need or it's not showing that they want to meet that need, then I may end up feeling like, oh well, there's no point. And if there's no point, then that creates not only the distance of the conflict itself, but the added distance of feeling like my needs are not important and my needs are not going to be met within the context of the relationship. And that's true whether it's a very major need or something that's really not so major, but it's important enough for me to bring up. What's going to end up happening is that I'm going to feel like that need is not going to be met, and that serves to drive the two people apart. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it can also be a catalyst for increased closeness. So when I try to have one of my needs met, I'm making myself vulnerable by showing I have a need. This is something that's important to me, and I'm sharing it with you. I'm showing you that there's something that I need that I don't have. There's something that I can't do for myself. And by you stepping up and saying, I'll help you with that, this is how I can help you with that, or even if you can't actually help, by saying that's a valid need and I see that you have that need and I appreciate it. I appreciate your sharing that need. That's something which brings the two people closer together. That's something which creates a bigger sense of trust. It creates a bigger sense of closeness and it makes the relationship overall much stronger. I'm going to lay out the program and the structure that we present when we do the Shalom workshop as a guideline for how to have an effective conflict discussion. As we said, in order to be certain you don't get sidetracked, you need to have a plan and you need to have a structure. And the more structured your approach is, the less chance there is of going off. So here are the steps to follow when you're approaching a conflict situation. First step is to invite your spouse to discuss the issue. Make an appointment for it. Don't let this be something that just bubbles out at a time that one of you or neither of you are really ready for it. Generally speaking, going back to the seltzer bottle analogy, when you open the seltzer bottle and you're not venting it carefully, everything spills out. It's not controlled, it's not directed, it's not focused, and it's definitely not going to be a productive discussion at all. By making an appointment for your discussion, you can go in being ready for it. You can have the mindset of doing your best to avoid a blowout. So you're going to prepare what you're going to talk about. You're going to think about exactly what you want to say, how you want to say it, and you're going to take the time to think about exactly what's going to happen during this discussion. The point is to make this discussion as purposeful and directed as possible. It's also going to give you a script to follow that's in line with the message that you want to relay. You want to be very careful about figuring out exactly what message it is that you want to relay to your spouse. Once you actually sit down with your spouse to have this discussion, stick with one specific focus and one specific event. Generalizing to numerous behaviors like you always do this, you never do that, is not solution focused. And once you start generalizing, probably you'll end up jumping into other emotional triggers while you're at it. Let's say you always leave things on the floor. So that, saying you always do that, it's not just one event, it's not just one thing that happened. You're going to start talking about all the times that you left things on the floor. Maybe it also relates to how you feel about how your spouse's cleanliness standards affect you, and maybe that feels more personal to you, and you'll get into that as well. Once you start generalizing beyond one specific focus or one specific event, you're going to end up going all over the place. If you focus on one event, you're more likely to be able to actually find a solution to whatever your concerns are. Once you've expressed your thoughts, your spouse is going to reflect back. Now, the point of this is to make sure that your spouse understands what you've said. This clarifies that they've understood you, and that knowing that you'll have to repeat back also helps your spouse pay more attention and try to pick up the nuances of what they're saying. They should make an effort to show empathy and caring when they speak. Again, you want to design this discussion to be the most productive, and whenever you're in a conflict situation, the only way to make sure that the negative emotions don't get out of hand is by making sure that both of you are speaking in a way which expresses caring and kindness to the other person. And this comes back to you, because once they reflect back what you're going to say, you're going to show appreciation to your spouse for having actually listened to you and made an effort to understand what the problem is, which quite honestly is half the battle right there. Showing appreciation doesn't mean to just say thank you and move on. The words thank you are very cheap. You want to really express what you appreciate about your spouse listening to you and what it means to you that your spouse was able to do that. And then after you do that, and this is going to be a pattern throughout these conflict steps, your spouse is going to reflect that back to you. You appreciate that I listen to you because that makes you feel validated, because that helps you to feel better about the situation, that helps you to feel like we're working together on this. Whatever it is that you said, whatever it is that you really do appreciate about your spouse speaking with you about this issue, your spouse is going to reflect that back to you. At that point, you're going to ask for what you want to happen instead of what did happen. Again, being specific is key. If you would say, what can you do for me, you'd be leaving the floor wide open to solutions that you're not happy with. Usually, people know exactly what they want. You know what you want. The reason that you're not saying exactly want is because there's some sort of fear of disappointment. You're not really so convinced that your spouse is really going to do exactly what you want, so you want to avoid getting into that can of worms. If you voice your preference, though, it gives a benchmark for where you want the conversation to go, and it makes it much more likely that your needs will be met appropriately. If you don't tell your spouse what you want, they're not going to do what you want. If you do tell your spouse what you want, then there's the possibility that they may do what you want, or even if not, they know kind of in which direction you would prefer things to go, and they'll try to work with you, hopefully. Ask if your spouse is willing to do what you've asked, and follow up by showing appreciation for your spouse listening to you. Again, showing appreciation. Why is it important to you that your spouse listens to you? What does it actually mean to you? You want to also make sure that your spouse knows you're not expecting exactly what you say to happen, and you're just voicing what you'd like to see. If you give the impression of my way or the highway, then your spouse is likely to shut down and not engage in problem solving. If somebody thinks my way or the highway is the whole point of this discussion, then you're effectively shutting them out of the conversation. It doesn't even become a conversation. It becomes more of a monologue about things that are going wrong and things that you wish happened, but there's no opportunity for them to really have a voice in making things better for both of you. So to this question of will you do what I need to do, or can you help me in this way, your spouse is going to respond with either yes or no, or yes with conditions. Now it's their turn to have a choice to voice their concerns with what you've suggested. And now the cycle of reflection and presentation continues. You start back by them reflecting, well, if I do this, then I'm concerned that maybe this will happen. And I don't want that to happen. And then you thank them for sharing. And then you go back and forth with the reflecting and the back and forth of saying exactly how you would like this to play out until you actually come to some kind of a reasonable solution that you're both comfortable with. This all sounds very good on paper. To have a structured conversation and to follow steps and to have a respectful back and forth sounds really great. Reality is that, especially with touchy subjects, these conversations can be very difficult, and very often they can trigger people in an emotional way. As we said before, we don't get into fights about things that are not important to us. We don't have conflict discussions about things which really don't matter. Anything that you're willing to have a conflict discussion with your spouse about is obviously something which is important. And if it's important, you could be triggered, or your spouse could be triggered, either way. If you see that your spouse is being triggered, then you reassure them that you're not trying to hurt them, you're not trying to scare them, or whatever you feel the source of that trigger is. This speaks directly to the feelings which are making them feel unable to engage. And by reassuring them, oh, I see that you're feeling angry, or I see that you're feeling upset about this, I'm not trying to upset you. I want to solve this concern. If you notice yourself feeling triggered and you're unable to continue the conversation without getting off track, that's fine too. The conversation is not going to go your way just because you're the one who initiated the conversation. Just because you invited your spouse to discuss what's going on doesn't mean that you're not going to lose control of where the conversation goes. And losing control can be a very scary thing. It could suggest my needs are not going to be met. It could also suggest something to you about the nature of your relationship, which it doesn't have to, but it's okay to tell your spouse that you need a timeout. Say that you need a timeout for a specific amount of time, say between 20 and 40 minutes. This gives you time to regain your balance, time to kind of regroup with yourself, and to come back to what your original message was. Move yourself physically, move yourself elsewhere, go to a different room, involve yourself in physical activity, come back exactly when you said you would, express your appreciation for your spouse in re-engaging, and then you can pick up where you left off, or pick up at the beginning if that's what you need to do. This may seem unnatural and it may seem strange. People feel like that about formulaic conversations. That's just the fact. People, when they're having conversations, they like saying what they want to say and saying it in the way that they want to say it. It's going to feel like that. At the beginning, it's going to feel very formulaic. It's going to feel very strange, and you're going to feel self-conscious about it. Many of us are not used to openly airing concerns in general. Openly airing concerns and complaints is something that most people feel very nervous about. Part of this is because, as I said, we're afraid our needs aren't going to be met, and that makes us feel rejected when our spouse is not willing to work with us on these things. It gives us a sense of loss. It gives us a sense of disconnection, and those two are two of the most painful senses that a human being can handle. To feel disconnected from someone who's so important to you, to feel as if you've lost something in this relationship, or to maybe you suspected that you lost it and this is just confirming it. But either way, many people tend to avoid these kinds of conversations for specifically these reasons. People tend to avoid directly addressing conflict head on, and the conflict just kind of simmers there. It just sits there and doesn't really do much, except for wait to boil out and wait for the seltzer bottle to explode. Not avoiding hard discussions has a few very obvious benefits, though. First is you become more in touch with what you want and how you feel when you have to focus on specifics. If you just know that something is wrong, but you don't have a conversation about what it is that's wrong, and you don't have to discuss it, then you'll never really necessarily put your finger on it. You don't need to. You just know this is bad. You don't really bother to think about why it's bad. The most obvious one is because if you have a conversation about conflict, then you're much more likely to have your needs met, at least in some way. You also develop a stronger sense of trust in your spouse when you're met with empathy and cooperation. This is made even stronger when your problem is actually solved. Again, solving the problem is great, but a very big benefit of having these conversations is to build that connection with your spouse and to build that sense of trust with your spouse. I trust that they have my back and that they want to help me with this. Now, there's no such thing as a truly stagnant relationship. It's either becoming stronger and more closely connected and in tune with each other, or it's degrading into a state of disconnection and drift. In these trying times, we find ourselves under the microscope of our spouse's constant company. Let's take advantage of this chaotic opportunity to not just survive, but to become closer and to become much stronger in our relationships with the people who are supposed to be the most important people in our lives. If you have any questions about anything we speak about on these podcasts, or if you'd like to find out more about our educational program, please feel free to contact us at ykraus@shalomtaskforce.org. You can also look us up online on our website at www.shalomtaskforce.org. You can call our hotline if you have questions about your own relationships and you're concerned that you may be in an abusive or unhealthy relationship. You can call our hotline at 718-337-3700 or toll free at 888-883-2323. With questions about your relationship, we offer a listening ear and referrals to various services which may be of use to you. So give us a call. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.